Is that better? Do we have sound? Ah, thank goodness. Oh man, sometimes my all of it just decides to go like. um, I had a couple meetings today or this week, not today, but this week that were Zoom oriented, and so I had to go in and do some stuff. So who knows? There's no reason for it to stop working, but it does. So how you been doing, Double T? Yeah, good. An interesting thing, this child soundtrack that I've been playing doesn't get muted. The very cool like lo-fi hip hop and all those, it keeps getting muted. And now this is all copyright free music. This is, allowed to use it online, which, whatever. But anyway, very interesting. I don't know what you're up to, Twitch, but let's see. Let me turn off my desktop audio because I'm getting some messages and you guys are probably hearing that noise. So happy Friday Eve, guys. Oh my goodness. This week has gone by so fast. It's been a crazy week. I gotta say, the hey Robin, yeah, it is. It's the Slack. Totally fine. I'll read it when we're done. So like, oh man, and I told you my husband is away. He's dealing with family stuff, and that's been emotionally draining. Just trying to support him, and it's his family. I love them, right? They're same thing. So. Thank you, Mod Art Quilt. That's one of my absolute favorites. Today is going to be a nerdy day, and there's going to be some cakes, hot takes. But so, yeah, yesterday I decided, I had a bunch of calls. I watched the textile talk yesterday. I don't know if anybody saw that about AI and fiber artists. It was a little technical, but it was really interesting. And so if you didn't catch it, I don't know. There might be a little bit of a delay when they put the textile talks on YouTube. I can't remember. I don't know, but definitely it'll be there. If it's not there today, it'll be there this week. So yeah, definitely. Check it out, Mod Art Quilt. It's interesting. They mention quilting a little bit, but it's mostly more about they talk about embroidery, they talk about crochet. It's really interesting. And they get into Chat GPT and all this stuff that we kind of played with, and it's really interesting. So anyway, after all that yesterday, I got my second wind and said, you know what? I'm gonna move some things around, look through some of my boxes that I'm kind of got piled up and need to sort and do things with, and then fold a few quilts. I've got a pile back here that I just need to like refold and put away. And right, Robin? I know. Anyway, and this is what goes on in my head as I'm going about my day. Is like, oh my gosh, it's almost the end of March. Or, well, it's the middle of March. It's the center. We are in the exact center of March. It feels like it's almost gone. And I mean, yeah, it's the first quarter of the year. Right? And so, yeah, so all that's in my head, and I'm thinking, yeah, there's all this stuff that I wanted to do, like, right after the holidays. I had on my to-do list, so I started doing some of these things last night. Again, this is not, like, super, I don't know, like, strenuous stuff. It's, like, folding some quilts and moving them in another room. And I gotta tell you guys, by the end of a couple hours last night of just sort of shuffling around and doing stuff, it was not hardcore, like, labor. I felt like I was about to die. And I was like, I need to take an Advil and lay down. And so I did, and I like slept for 11 hours. Obviously, this COVID it is strong. I think what I've sort of surmised is that we're having this really beautiful weather here, and I think we're at that point in March where it's blooming season, and so the pollen is starting to whip up, and I think that COVID tag teamed with my allergies, tapped out, and my allergies came in. So I think that's what's going on. But honestly, part of the issues that I've had with COVID were, with the exception of a couple of symptoms, they're like allergy symptoms that I've suffered from my whole life. Right? Oh, so. Anyway, that's where I'm coming from. Who knows how long and how the stream may be, I don't know, half an hour. It might be 3 hours. Who knows? Um, yeah. Can I taste again? Sort of. There are certain things that I think, like spicy and salty, I can tell. Like when I cook, I can tell if something's too salty. Um, but I still, like, sweet still's kind of not there. And yeah, like just the nuance of flavor is just not there. So I don't know if it's a matter of like I'm not tasting at all or I'm sort of starting to taste. Like I think it's probably a little bit of starting to taste a little bit. So I don't know. We'll see. Well, what do we have to do today? Oh, what is this? What do you have here? Oh my gosh, what is this? It's hidden in plain view. Y'all, while I was COVIDing, when I was awake last week, a week before last, I was reading this book. You know, I said I was going to do it. And I have finished. And look, I have never marked up a book so much in my entire life. I mean, we're talking college textbooks for like degree winning exams. I never marked something up this much. I have so much to say about this book now that I've read it. I am not cutting Jackie Tobin and Raymond Dobard I'm not cutting them any slack. I got stuff to say. It's nothing I'm going to say is new probably, but, you know, just as the next generation of quilt opinion. But I also have, you know, I have thoughts. We'll get there in a minute. Okay. But yeah, this book. And the other thing is, I was looking for my Gladys Marie Fry book. She was and I've mentioned her a number of times. She was a professor, and I believe it was African American Studies and Folklore. And please, guys, correct me if I'm wrong. You can probably Google her and find out quickly. But she was a professor at the University of Maryland, here in Maryland. And unfortunately, she passed away like right before I started reading about a lot of this stuff. And, you know, I think my mom had her book, has her book and had her book, you know, for a long time. And I'm just like kicking myself because I'm, you know, not necessarily that she would have been somebody I could have just picked up the phone and said, hey, Professor Fry, can we get together? But, you know, just her voice being there and continuing to write and speak about things. She passed away. I think it was in the 2000 teens. It was definitely before the pandemic. Maybe 2019, something like that. I'm just going off the top of my head here. I could be wrong. I've also been throwing, you know, and here's something, you guys, I completely forgot. I needed to correct the record on something. I've been bad about just throwing out like, oh, these old school quilters and historians, etc., have passed away. You guys, not only is Georgia Bonesteel still with us, but I believe Eleanor Burns is too. And I think both of them, I said, oh, they passed away. They have not. And I had to correct that. Our dear friend, while I was at QuiltCon, had been watching some of my back catalog of replays, and she said, I know you're busy at QuiltCon, but when you get back, here's a couple things to think about. One was this really great article she sent me, and I'm going to read it to you guys because it's I think in as a response to this, it's really good. And then she said the other thing that you want to think about is Georgia Bonesteel's not dead. And I'm like, how embarrassing. So yeah, I'm going on the record here. I'm going to stop saying people are deceased until I see their death date. But I can tell you, I do know for a fact that Gladys Marie Fry is deceased. But anyway, long story short, I was looking for her book because I wanted to look in there and see some things because I know she's referenced in here, and I can't remember if her book predated this or if they're around the same time, but it's information I wanted to look at and kind of compare. And so I'm worried I have lent the book to somebody. I have one more pile I didn't access because it's behind stuff. You guys, I need a book solution. You know, for those of you that were, big time quilt nerds, you know that Mary Fonz has those big, beautiful library carts in her office. I don't have that. I just have a million bookshelves, and when the bookshelves are full, the books just stack up. So that is my summer project, is really to get my books in order, along with all the other things. But anyway, so while I was looking for my Gladys Marie Fry book, I knew my Cuesta Benberry book was in there. And this is the Cuesta Benberry book, A Piece of My Soul, Quilts by Black Arkansans. And I thought today we'll kind of do a little bit of old school. I'm going to give you my snark on Hidden in Plain View. And then what I thought we could do, I have my document camera set up here. I thought we could look at the quilts in A Piece of My Soul, because they are beautiful quilt pictures. And then look back at this one, the Arkansas Quilt Project, the documentation project, and kind of look at the quilts, because we've got this book with amazing African American quilts, and then we've got historic quilts. And I don't think there's a whole lot of overlap, but just looking at the quilt styles, I think will be really interesting and fun. So I thought that's what we would do today. Just a couple of announcements. I'm trying to get better at this. As you guys know, I'm here Mondays and Thursdays, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Jill and I are also doing quilt nerding, and that is Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. And we've been streaming to YouTube, and we have a little library of videos up there now. And we are reading... I put it on the couch. I need to read my next set of papers, but we're reading Quilt Making in America, which is a fantastic book. It's papers from the American Quilt Study Group's journal Uncoverings from the years 1980-ish to 1989. And they're divided into these kind of neat little, 3 papers per topic. So it's been a really good book, and we've learned a lot. So anyway, if you have not joined us there, just check it out. Even if you're not reading the book, it's kind of interesting, and we always have lots of hot takes. So another thing, I know our friend Mama is a fan. She is a new cakelet. She stopped by, I don't know, it's been a week or two ago. She won't be here today, and I know that because I watched her stream the other day. And she's got if you guys haven't followed her and checked out some of her replays or joined her live, she's got lots of good quilting advice. So she's actually like sewing machine cams and stuff. So definitely, if Druid, if you can give her a shout out, I know she's not here, but just give her a shout out so that people can follow her. She was doing binding the other day, and I will give you another Twitch stream to check out. It's Mom and Pop's Quilting. And what she said was amazing to me. She had made this beautiful, it was a drunkard's path. And I guess it was probably like a baby quilt size wall hanging. I assume probably she's going to use it as a wall hanging. But all of the long armors that she knows here in the States were just like really booked up. So she got in touch with these folks in Canada, Mom and Pop. And the price that they gave her just to do a... I think it was like an edge to edge with some border, some fanciness on the border. They, oh, thank you. Cool. So they gave her this like really amazing price to just do that quilting on this small piece. And for her, it was worth it. The shipping, to Canada and back is often pricey. But I don't know, they had some good deal for her. So shout out to them. I apologize. I'm not sure. It's Mom and Pop's Quilt. I'm following them. So, I'll be sure next time to give them a proper shout out, but go check them out. If you go to Mama is a Fan, she's got them listed as the alternate channels for when she's not on. So anyway, so there's that. And then the other thing, do you guys remember when I played, or I sort of demoed the beta for you of Cats and Quilts? Do you remember this? This was back in the fall. And let's see. Oh, my computer is doing all its stupid jazz. I was going to share my screen just to show you. Steam. Let's see. So this is Steam. And if you are a gamer, you know. But if you are not a gamer and you're interested in checking this out, go online to Steam and look for Quilts and Cats of Calico. Calico was a board game that came out, I don't know, a number of years ago. It was a Kickstarter. I got in on it after the Kickstarter was over and got the board game. It's a really beautiful board game. But I'll be honest, the online version of it is so much better because it does all the scoring for you. But anyway, it's essentially like you're building a quilt, and there's all these different design challenges, like where you're matching up the hexes by color and pattern, and by whether the cats like it or not. And of course, there's cats, and they'll walk all over your quilt, and you can pet them. And so it's really cool. And you can also, there's the, you know, your standard game engine in there where you can say, like, I want to build my cat. So you can make some of the cats look like your own cats. Like, it's just such a cool thing. And the gameplay is not competitive. Like, you can play alongside other people. And the only competitive aspect of it is that, you know, you're picking all of these quilt blocks, or they're hexes. You're picking the hexes, and so you might have your eye on a hexie, and like one of your competitors gets it. So like that's really the only competition that's in there. It's not like you're racing against people, or, you know, you're comparing your quilt to theirs. It's nothing like that. It's just very easygoing. And I think it might be fun to do some, like, I don't know, like a gaming night or something. So if you guys are interested, let me know. Jill's already in. I already told her she's got to go get this so that we can play. But it's just really fun, and it's, you know, it's just something that everybody needs their brain to shut down and do something, like, wholesome every now and then. And the world is too crazy. So, we've got that. Just putting it out there. Okay. You guys ready to talk about this? Excuse me. I don't want to be rude, but I'm kind of like, oh, yay, Michelle, yay. You know what? Did I say hi to everybody? I'm sitting over here hacking and wheezing, and let me turn my thing back on. So, yes, who is here? Michelle, Quiltish, Jill, Robin, Mod Art. We played a blurb. Blurp is here. Druid, my darling. Druid is always here early. See, guys, I'm so glad you're here. And I know I have lurkers. I love you, my lurkers. I know who you are. So I keep wanting to say, like, let's talk about this trash. It's not trash. I bet you're surprised that I said that. There is a lot of good information in here. Now, the veracity of the information is what is troubling, because these tabs are all things where, as I was reading, I was like, wow, I've got questions. This book generated far more questions than it did answers. And a lot of my questions, again, are around, like, these statements that Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond Dobard made. And the fact that, you know, again, they're making these statements, and there's a lot of this, oh shoot, I just saw where it's a lot of this, if so-and-so is true, may not this be true? Like, there's that statement over and over and over. And, excuse me, I liken this to, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the, you know, the old, I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory, I don't know what to call it, but, you know, people that like to look at, like, the Kennedy assassination, and then they'll look at Lincoln's assassination, they'll be like, you know what? Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Oh my God. Right? And did you know that Kennedy's assassin fled from a book depository to a theater, and Lincoln's assassin fled from a theater to a book depository? He didn't, by the way. But it's these kind of, like, these sort of, like, folklore type of stories. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln or if Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. It's just a thing I've heard. And it's kind of like, well, that's interesting. If it's true, what a coincidence, right? Our world is full of coincidences. Some of them are so big that it's hard to ignore. You know, you look at a coincidence and you're like, that's hard to explain just being random. But the thing is, like, the world is random. People develop ideas and stuff like in far-flung parts of the world. You know, the whole idea of, like, you know, correlation and causation, like all of that kind of stuff. When you look at, I don't even know what that body of science is other than critical thinking. But critical thinking will tell you that, like, you can't just latch on to coincidences and things that look like they fit together. You know, you have to take this, like, back up and take this sort of skeptical look at things. I think that's probably the best way to look at things. Like, when you see something that looks like, oh my gosh, is this the missing piece? Is this the thing that completes the puzzle for me? You have to look at it with a certain sense of skepticism. And so in reading this book, I have, like, a real sense of skepticism. And so, with all of these things, then so here's an example where she says, might not the juxtaposition of brightly colored fabric cause the quilt top to appear light-filled and therefore attractive to roaming spirits? Sorry, I have my windows open. I don't know if you can hear the sirens. We were told on several occasions that different herbs and other objects were placed in the batting, the middle layer of the quilt, in order to give the quilt curative powers. Might not color serve the same purpose? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. It probably did. But all of that might not. That's the problem with this book. Everything is, well, if this is true, might not this be true? I kind of just already said this. Bottom line, I think Miss Ozella told Jacqueline this story and kept her imagination alive because she did want her story out there. Now, this story she's telling, this quilt code, to me, in reading it as told to Jacqueline and the subsequent conversations that Jacqueline had with her, it seems to me that this is a family story that is probably rooted in family history. And so it's not her grandmother and her mother were not saying, look at this quilt. This quilt was a map that told freedom seekers XYZ. And when this quilt was hanging out there, it gave them all this information. I do not think that's what the story was, and I don't know if it got lost in translation between Miss Ozella and Jacqueline, or if Miss Ozella was telling it in a way, But what I see it as is this teaching, this storytelling and teaching within the family unit. And her great-grandmother or her grandmother and her mother were saying things like, here's this quilt, and, this block says blah, blah, blah. And, this was when the runaway slaves did this. And this block tells this, and this is, that's what it says to me. It's this family, the family histories, the folklore of actual freedom seekers, whether they were Underground Railroad or, simply run away on their own, without the assistance of the Underground Railroad. All that stuff filters down. I mean, we all have family stories like that. Unless you're completely removed from your family of origin. If you were raised by parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, all that, you heard these stories of your family. And, down the generations, they get, like, real twisted, right? You find out something and you're like, oh. In my case, it was, finally did my genealogy and had my DNA tested, and also other members of my family, and we all came together and went, well, you remember that story? Well, it's clearly not true. The great-grandmother who was supposed to have been a Cherokee princess, how many East Coast white people who have been around, our families have been here for a while, have that story? A lot of us. So, again, it goes back to these family stories and the touchstones that that people can convey those stories with. And that is part of the African American tradition. That's the story quilt. One thing that I kind of was like, is that they quote Elizabeth Halford Scott in here. Now, Elizabeth Halford Scott was still alive when this book was written, and it appears to me that Jacqueline Tobin talked to her, if not via Raymond Dobard. Now, if you remember, Raymond Dobard was a professor at Howard University, so down in D.C., and of course Elizabeth Halford Scott lived here in Baltimore, hour apart. It's entirely possible, and I would venture to guess that they definitely knew each other. But the way that Elizabeth Halford Scott's story is presented about the plantation quilt, if you guys remember what that one looked like, let's see, I don't think I have it right here. I have too much stuff on my desk. But it was the one, it's kind of like a sort of a light color, almost like a white cream color, and then it's got the stars all over it. Now, the way Elizabeth Halford Scott explains that quilt is her parents were sharecroppers. They lived on the property of a plantation. And so the way she made that quilt was based on her memories of the women in her family. I think probably her mother, aunts, sitting on the porch and quilting, and the actual land of the plantation and where her parents had, were growing their crops. And this is all her actual personal memories that she put into this quilt. And then there is the storytelling of, her ancestral story that's in there. And so that's the part where we're like, yeah, this is, it's easy to I think it's much easier to analyze something when you have the first person, right? This is the person who made this quilt. This person's memories are in this quilt. When you're talking about several generations removed, there's a lot of people's memories that are in the quilt. There's the person that made it, who may not even be alive anymore to tell you. There's the person who got the story from them and, hopefully has preserved this quilt. You've maybe got a third generation down where the quilt's been lost and they only have the stories. So I feel like, and again, I will never put this in writing because I'm sitting here just conjecture. I don't have any experience in this other than what I have personally observed. What I can tell you though is I'm a white lady, but I do live in an area of the country where, in terms of diversity, there's a lot of African American folks that live in Baltimore. It was part of the Southern diaspora. There were people that came to Baltimore. There were people that went to New York, people that went to Chicago. Ohio figures big time in this story. I didn't realize. Their theory, what they've put forth, is that the story of the quilt code is explaining the path from Charleston, South Carolina, across the Appalachians, so across the mountain chain that people hike today and die doing, across this mountain chain to Ohio, which had a direct route into Canada. And so Ohio it's not just a theory. Ohio indeed was a destination. But what the Underground Railroad scholars have said is that there were multiple destinations. You had folks from the South trying to go straight up the coast, and I say coast just meaning close to the East Coast. And minus all of our highways of today, that's kind of the easiest route. There's rivers that run north-south. You can kind of follow up. And the National Park Service has documented Harriet Tubman's efforts on the eastern shore of Maryland, because that's where Harriet Tubman was born. And so there's a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of hardcore evidence, but there's enough that they could trace this and kind of understand that route. And then this route to Ohio was kind of a separate Western group. And when I say Western, I don't mean West Coast. I mean West Virginia Western. And it was there were two pathways, or there were multiple pathways. There was pathways by water off of the East Coast and up north. So by no means am I any kind of Underground Railroad scholar. I know this much, and I've read the National Park Service stuff. That's what I know. But the very information that they try to stand behind here, the actual Underground Railroad scholars, which I'm going to read one to you, they're like, no, this just doesn't work out. It just doesn't work out. So, what I'd like to do, I said I was not going to read any of this book, but I am. I'm going to read you just one section, and I'm going to read you a couple of other things, like just passages out of here. Crossing my fingers, this isn't a massive copyright infringement, but, you know, from the purpose of criticism, you're allowed to quote. So that's really what I want to do, is I want to put forth, I think, so that you guys can understand, if you don't have this book and you haven't read it, understand my knee-jerk reaction to the way that she sets this story in motion. And then after Miss Ozella passed away, there's an epilogue to this book where she I feel like she doubles down on the arrogance is essentially what I'm saying here. The problems that I have with this book boil down to two things. One is the arrogance with which this story is told, and two is just the tone, and it would have only taken a slight shift about NPR. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, this is interesting. A quilt code at QuiltCon. Yeah, the quilt code that was posted at QuiltCon was with the African American Guild. I can't remember what their full name is, but it's the Durham, North Carolina Guild. They were there with their raffle quilt and a small show of their member quilts. And so, yeah, there was a code quilt there. The interesting thing about their code quilt was it was not this exactly. And the way I looked at their code quilt was from the perspective of, well, you know what? I like the fact that you brought that up, because here's the difference. There's the aspect of all of this symbology, and I don't know what the right words I'm looking for, but symbology is probably the best way to say it. This symbology, that an imagery that comes from the African diaspora, and of course, people coming from there, they bring that wherever they go. And you know, of course, with the slave trade that came here to the United States in the early days, and some of those symbols just come down through family history. And sometimes they retain their actual meaning, their, you know, very original meaning. But like I said, game of telephone among your family members through the generations, things start to change a little bit. Also, things mash up when you meet other people, maybe from different cultures, that have something similar, something oppositional, you know, those things change a little bit. And so I did not examine the quilt code quilt that was there very, very closely, but it had things in it like, look at, you know, and I'm just pulling this out of my butt because I can't remember specifically, but it's like, look at this Yoruba symbol and how there's this American quilt block that kind of, you know, like that, it was that kind of thing. And I think that is incredible study because, again, you're looking at things from one country, and again, the people from that country or from that continent coming and going to a different place, and how, you know, that folklore and symbology and imagery then came down through the generations. That, I think, is just a wonderful way of looking at things. And then you're kind of like, all like, this is all theory, but, you know, we're tracing these steps. And again, without, you know, written or, you know, some kind of explicit proof, it's really hard to say. It's really hard to trace every single step when you don't have documentation. But honestly, everything's like that. You know, it's not just, you know, our African American quilters that are struggling with this. It's all of our quilts, because they're not dated, they're not signed. We all have to make this supposition and guesses, and, you know, we have our theories, and that is the story. You know, that is the wonderful story about all this, is the different stories that have come down through families, the theories that have been assigned. And if Ozella Washington's story was presented that way, Ozella Williams, if her story was presented that way, I think there would be so much more respect for this. But the story was presented in a way that was wrong. Like, Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond Dobar took it and ran with it, with this theory that was just wrong, is probably the wrong word to use, but it didn't make sense. If they had utilized the story in the right way, I think this could have really been an incredible work, because there was research. And, Raymond Dobard, as a African American scholar, he had, I think, had a lot of information to put in here. But kind of full circle here, what I was going to say earlier was, I have a hard time trusting the information that's put forth about, various communities in different countries in Africa, because, well, you guys came up with all these other weird suppositions about things I do know about, where I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So when it comes to these stories coming from Africa, I'm like, do I trust you? Right? Like, are you a scholar in that? Like, can I trust your research? This is what's really hard about criticizing other people's work, is like, ooh, I hate to put that out there to say, like, do I trust anything you say? There's one aspect of this story that, like, really bothers me, and I think it was something like that maybe Ozella Williams kind of thought it sounded good. Basically what she said with the tied quilts, and I can say there's a picture in here, I think, where she shows the back of a quilt to explain this. It's in a color picture section. But basically she's saying these knots, there's 5 knots, and what that says is, this thing. So here's the picture. And so the top, this is the front of the quilt, and then what you see here is the back of the quilt. And if you've ever examined a tied quilt, this makes sense to you. You've seen this before. But what she's saying is that there's the symbology in the 5 knots. So it's not just a square knot. It's 5 times. Well, there's symbology in that, and great. But what she's saying is that this symbology of 5 knots communicates XYZ. And that the distance is marked here. And that, there's the specific distance you travel based on the squares. Now, if what they're saying, if again, I can only interpret what I read through my own lens. But basically what they're saying is, like, you're supposed to grab this quilt and you're going to count all the squares. And you're going to be like, all right, I got to go 10 miles or I got to go 50 miles. Are you carrying the quilt with you? Like, are you carrying this quilt with all of this information in it, like, on your back? Okay, that makes sense. I mean, if you are escaping, certainly you want to take some food and something to, you want to take something to keep you warm, right? A bedroll or something. I mean, that makes a perfect sense. But the point being, like, are you using a quote unquote map quilt? And who made this quilt? And where did they get this information? And why aren't they free? This is all the questions. And, the problem becomes that we don't have these quilts and we don't have any written history, and all of this was supposed to be secret. And that's quite convenient, when all of it was hush hush oral history and none of the quilts exist. It's easy to fall back on, well, it was all a secret. Well, yeah, but also, nobody can keep a secret. You got 2 people with a secret. It only stays a secret when one of them is dead. Like, that's just how people are. So, again, I go back to the fact that I think that there were very sophisticated plans in motion for freedom seekers vis-a-vis the Underground Railroad. But there were also many, many freedom seekers that saw an opportunity and booked it. And that is just, again, the reality of what happens when, a person is in captivity. So, oh boy, I can't wait to read this NPR article touting the authentic quilt code. Yeah. Well, and authentic code quilts. Well, if they have them, like, what? Where's the book about that? This one didn't work out too well. So let's go ahead. Let me go ahead and read you this entry story here. And I'm going to try to I'm going to have to comment because I think that keeps me safe from copyright, but I'm going to try to read this, like, without the nasty tone that I hear in my head. It was so terrible. And then I want to read you this piece that is literally a paper, or like I would say it's more of like a white paper than an academic paper, that is a response to this book by an actual Underground Railroad scholar. Okay, so in here, this is the author's note, and it's called Write This Down, of course, by Jacqueline Tobin. And this is the very beginning. This is telling us, how she came to know Ozella Williams and how she started getting the story. So, oh, and also she's from Colorado. I don't think that is very clear in here. I don't remember that she actually says that, but she is from Colorado. I don't know if she still lives there, and I don't know if she's a native. But in 1994, she was living in Colorado, and she's a writer / journalist. She's not a person that knows quilts. I think she had an interest in crafts of African American people. This is going to become apparent in the first sentence I read you, but that's pretty much all I know about her background. I probably should do my work and find out more about Jackie and find out, what her history is. But at this point, this is what I know. All right. So in 1994, I traveled to Charleston, South Carolina to learn more about the sweetgrass baskets unique to this area and to hear the stories of the African American craftswomen who make them. Now, if you've never been to Charleston or to the eastern part of South Carolina, I mean, there's history upon history there. And, good, bad, and ugly. There's beautiful architecture. There's just incredible stories. It's very like the center of Charleston's very like, quaint, historic kind of stuff. There's the ugly stories about the plantations. But there is a culture, a community of the Gullah, which, they are slave descendants. They're living in a swampy area. This whole area of Charleston is very swampy. There's only certain crops, or I don't want to say certain crops that grow there, but there's certain crops that grow there well. Rice is real big in Charleston. So you have a very interesting history in terms of trade routes, because it's, there's the port, all kinds of stuff. Charleston's a very interesting area. The Gullah women make these sweetgrass baskets. I have 2 of them. They're tiny because they're pricey. They're beautiful. And of course, I'm not saying they don't deserve every penny, but I don't have a big one because I can't afford it. But they're very beautiful, and they're utilizing the sweetgrass. And the ladies will, in the marketplace of Charleston, you can go down there and see them. They have their booths where they're selling them, and they're sitting right there in the booth making them. Some of the hotels will have sweetgrass basket makers that come in and do demonstrations and stuff. And it's a huge tourist trade. And it's such an interesting, history, and then the actual craft, the item that is the, the product of all of this history is so beautiful and interesting. But it's a big tourist thing. Like, they're making money off tourists. And good for them. They should. So this is why she's there, to look at the sweetgrass baskets, and they're very well known. Charleston is rich in history. A port city where the Ashley River meets the Cooper to form, as the locals like to say, the beginnings of the Atlantic Ocean. Charleston today is a place whose buildings and culture reflect the combined and separate histories of American and African American peoples. It is unique as the location where black slaves first set foot in American soil and once outnumbered the white population 4-1. There are other cities on the East Coast that had kind of a similar history. Alexandria, Virginia is one. And I encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, definitely, check out the history of some of these other places along the East Coast, because they have similar and varying histories. A walk through the historic district of Charleston is like a walk through the corridors of American Southern history. Here, one is confronted by all the hustle and bustle of the retentions and recreations of a bygone era. At the heart of historic Charleston is an imposing brick enclosure with open sides known as the Old Marketplace. More than half of it is now kind of a mall. It's still got the old structure, it's still the brick thing, but some of the shops and restaurants in there now are fully enclosed. But they do still have the kind of the open air area. Baltimore also has a similar marketplace. I would say Charleston's is a little nicer than the Baltimore one. It looks very much as it did over 100 years ago, as it still defines the length of the district. As it was in years gone by, the marketplace is still the center of commerce for the area. Under the roof of the structure, long wooden tables laid end to end go on for blocks to create two narrow avenues for selling wares. As early as 1841, it was a marketplace for fresh vegetables, fish, meats, and other goods brought to Charleston from the surrounding farms and plantations and other coastal ports and faraway lands. It is still a vendor's market, but with stark contrasts between the old and the new. African American women sit by pails of sweetgrass and weave baskets, much as their African ancestors did over 100 years ago. But these craftswomen, many of them descendants of slaves, are now surrounded by merchants of flea market trinkets, southern memorabilia, and newer, cheaper baskets from China and Thailand. The smell of the daily ocean catch or freshly slaughtered meats is no longer the predominant early morning smell of the marketplace. In fact, there is an incredible biscuit restaurant. That's what you smell when you walk in there. It's like the biscuits baking. So delicious. Today, the aroma of freshly baked cookies and newly ground coffee beans from the gourmet shops and the biscuits surrounding the area compete for attention. Certain sounds can still be heard, the din of tourists and locals alike crowding the streets and trying to avoid the horses, their hooves providing the percussive rhythm for this city as they clap loudly over original cobblestone streets. So the carriages and the horses now are just like, you can rent a carriage to have like a horse-drawn carriage ride. That's what those are. There's not people doing business with horses necessarily. And I would say the din of tourists is much louder than the locals. The locals are down there to run their businesses, and the tourists are there to partake in that. Carriages are drawn around the district, past the custom house, and on toward the Battery. The Battery is by the water, whose decorative wrought iron fences accentuate the largesse of old historic homes. Now, the wrought iron of Charleston is world renowned, and there is this really interesting history there that of blacksmiths and people that came from communities in Africa where they were, they had blacksmith training. They were an important, the blacksmith was an important person within a community. They were one of those, it was one of those like trades where there was a lot of, I don't know, folklore, if that's the right word. There was a lot of maybe superstition around the blacksmith. And the blacksmith was somebody kind of to be feared and avoided unless you really needed them. Like, they kind of had that sort of aura about the blacksmiths. But in terms of American history, there were at least one who's very, very, very well known, but multiple enslaved people who were very, very talented blacksmiths and contributed to all of this wrought iron work that is all over Charleston. Some of it is, on the plantations. They have these beautiful fences. They have, cemeteries with the wrought iron. And it's, the history of it is interesting and important. And it's documented. I mean, that's the, and that's the difference between wrought iron and quilts. Wrought iron stands the test of time unless, there's a raging fire. Wrought iron melts, but otherwise, wrought iron is there. It's strong. Quilts can easily be lost or wear out. So, there's one problem there. Taverns and brothels have given way to fern bars and upscale hotels touting Southern hospitality and cuisine. I'm kind of curious, what's a fern bar? Do you guys know? I picture a fern bar as being one of those things in the 80s where it literally has ferns hanging around it, and it's still a bar, but it's the kind of place that's okay to go in the afternoon and have a glass of wine. That's what I picture a fern bar being. I'm wondering, am I right? Do you guys know? Newly restored on a lesser traveled street is the original Slave Mart, now a historical museum whose presence jars us into remembering a less civil piece of the history of this southern port city. Now, the Charleston Museum that she's talking about is Such a beautiful museum. If you get a chance to travel to Charleston for any reason, business or pleasure, make it a stop at the Charleston Museum. It's not huge. It won't take you all day to visit it, but it's a really cool stop. They have lots of really interesting stuff there. As I walked the aisles of the marketplace, I found myself standing in front of a stall lined with quilts of all sizes, colors, and patterns. I was drawn in by these piles of quilts, as long forgotten memories of my grandmother's quilt box, filled with her handmade quilts, were brought to mind. Before I could do much looking or reminiscing, an elderly African American woman, dressed in brightly colored, geometrically patterned African garb, slowly walked up to me from the back of the stall. She motioned me to follow her to the back, where an old metal folding chair sat surrounded by more quilts. Look, she said. She chose one of the quilts from the pile, unrolled it, and while pointing to it said, "Do you know that quilts were used by slaves to communicate on the Underground Railroad?" The old quilter continued to speak, but I could not hear her clearly in the midst of the noise of the marketplace around us. I wasn't sure why she was telling me, a complete stranger, this unusual story. I listened politely for a short while. When I didn't ask any questions, she stopped talking. I purchased a beautiful hand-tied quilt and left with her flyer advertising historic Charleston Marketplace quilts. Now, having never met Ozella Williams, I don't know, but in my mind I'm thinking, well, oh, okay, Fern Bar is American slang for an upscale or preppy or yuppie bar or tavern catering to singles, usually decorated with ferns, as well as decor such as fake Tiffany lamps. It's exactly what I thought it was. I was much too young to visit one of those, but I feel like in my mind, I can picture it. It's like the bar from Cheers, but maybe a little bit fancier. Like, yes, TGI Fridays, that's exactly what I was thinking. Oh my gosh, do you guys remember the original TGI Fridays, what that looked like? It was like the Tiffany lamps over the tables, and it's nothing like that anymore, but oh, that's funny. Where many young singles. When I lived in Richmond, I went to school in Richmond, Virginia, and at one point I lived on Boulevard, which is a major, I want to say it's called, was it called Arthur Ashe Boulevard now? It's like kind of the main thoroughfare right through the historic area. It's like one of the boundaries for what's called the Fan in Richmond, which is like the downtown, Victorian and early era homes. But anyway, I lived like way up there in this apartment. Students lived in there, and right around the corner was a place called Christopher's, which is like the dictionary definition of this Fern Bar. Well-dressed, upscale young people, initially from the sexual revolution in the 70s and later the yuppie area. Okay. Fern bars are talked of disparagingly as singles bars. You know what, you guys, my Three's Company fans, was the Regal Beagle a Fern Bar? I think the Regal Beagle was a Fern Bar. Okay, so Jackie has met Miss Ozella. Miss Ozella has said, "Do you know that quilts were used to communicate on the Underground Railroad?" Now think about the sweetgrass basket makers. They have this like kind of documented history going from basket makers of Africa. Now I don't know, are the techniques the same? I don't know. Is just the fact of basket making, was it something that kind of sprang up from early days of enslaved women saying like, well, I made baskets, before I was dragged over here, so I can make baskets with what they've got here, I mean, I hope that doesn't sound like disrespectful, but I mean, that's how things go. You're in captivity, you make do with what you've got around you based on what you know. So it makes entire sense to me that there were, women basket makers that, came here enslaved, and worked with what they had. And now, again, that family history of their descendants has come down. And the sweetgrass baskets, I haven't done the kind of research about the sweetgrass baskets that, but I think I'm right about that. I think that's kind of what the story is. But can you see Ozella Williams going, All right, my sweetgrass basket friends have this, whole African diaspora story going on. What can I do with my quilts? What about that story my grandmother and my mother used to say? Well, let me just use that as a marketing ploy. I mean, again, I'm not throwing any shade at Ozella Williams. I'm like, good going, lady. I mean, that is the way that you sell stuff. Is you've got these tourists coming from all over. Do they care about the quilt that you personally made? If you're not famous, probably not. But would they be very tantalized to think that they were holding the reproduction of a Underground Railroad quilt? That seems like a really good selling tactic to me. And I think that she was brilliant for that. To say things like that as like a marketing ploy. And I hope that's not sounding like rude or disrespectful, but I'm like, yeah, go on. Get that money, get that quilt money any way you can. I returned home with my quilt and memories of Charleston. I hung my quilt and laid my memories aside. I didn't think too much about my conversation with this quilter until several months later when I came across her flyer again. I remember the story she had started to tell me, and I wondered about it. I had never heard such a story or read about it in any books. I wonder why, Jackie. Was there more to the story? The flyer listed the quilter's name and phone number. I decided to call Mrs. Ozella McDaniel Williams and see if she would be willing to tell me more. When she answered the phone, I reminded her of who I was and asked if I might hear more about how quilts were used on the Underground Railroad. She told me curtly to call back the next evening, which I did. At that time, she said, I can't speak to you about this right now. When I tried pressing her, she laughed quietly and whispered into the phone, don't worry, you'll get the story when you're ready. And then she hung up. Now, again, I can only provide as much conjecture as Jacqueline Williams did, but I can picture this situation where Ozella Williams and her family are maybe sitting down to dinner, or maybe they finished dinner, and this call comes in from Colorado from this woman named Jacqueline, and she's been harassing and pestering, and Miss Ozella goes, I don't have time for this right now. And, her nephew's back here going, Auntie Ozella, are you trying to fool these people again? Like, knock that crap off. I mean, you just picture these things, and she's like, I'll tell you later. So she hangs up on Jackie. Ozella had now added an element of intrigue to an already fascinating story. I was hooked. That's exactly what she meant to do. What did she mean by, you'll get the story when you're ready? I felt I had to explore the story further. If she wouldn't talk, perhaps others would. I began to contact every African American quilter and quilt scholar I could find. I traveled down the Mississippi from St. Louis to New Orleans, stopping to visit quilters and scholars. I toured plantations and slave quarters looking for clues. Before long, I was speaking to a fairly close-knit circle of people that included art historians, African American quilters, African textile experts, and folklorists. From that perspective, like, good job. You're doing the work. Most of them had heard that quilts had been used as a means of secret communication on the Underground Railroad, but none were exactly sure how. Some referenced particular quilt patterns, some mentioning the stitching, and others cited specific colors. And I believe that this is some of the information that's in Gladys Marie Fry's book. I was not able to find any slave quilts that could verify these stories. Okay, well, we know why. If they existed, they're probably long gone. Most quilt scholars agreed that few slave quilts have survived the constant strain of excessive use, the poor quality of fabrics they had probably been sewn from, and the continual washing in harsh lye soap that would eventually cause them to disintegrate. As a white person conducting research into African American scholarship, I was hesitant at times to continue. Maybe you should have listened to your gut feeling, Jacqueline. Some people were reluctant to share family stories with me. At one point, I suggested that Dr. Raymond Dobard, one of the scholars I was conversing with, continue my research by contacting Ozella himself. I was hoping that she would speak more freely to another African American. Raymond, an art history professor, okay, so I'm sorry, I had said that he was an African American he was an art history professor at Howard University, a renowned quilter, and a known expert on African American quilts as they relate to the Underground Railroad. Okay. Seemed to me the perfect person to pursue this research with Ozella. However, when I made my suggestion, Raymond insisted that I was the one with whom Ozella felt comfortable telling the story initially, and thus should be the one to pursue it. He told me to be patient and that I would indeed get the story when I was ready. With his encouragement, I continued my research. 3 years after first hearing the story, I had come full circle with my research, but there were still missing pieces. I could add nothing new to the information that was already out there. Exactly, Jackie. Still lacking was an elaboration of the story connecting quilts and the Underground Railroad. I was hoping for a final link connecting all the quilt stories with details. My intuition told me that Ozella knew more than she'd already told me. The only way to find out would be to return to Charleston and see if she would speak to me again. Let me take a deep breath here. Without contacting her first, I arranged a return visit to Charleston. If Ozella was reluctant to speak, I didn't want to give her any time to think about it and turn me down without my ability to plead my case in person. Besides, I had done my homework, and maybe I thought I was now ready to receive the story in full. Armed with information and questions, I felt the time was right. Upon my arrival, I took a carriage tour around the historic Charleston district. I wanted to immerse myself once again in the flavor of the Old South before attempting to talk with Ozella. Let me stop right here and tell you. Now again, I'm a white lady. However, I live in a place where there's a lot of diversity. I have worked closely with and have a number of African American friends. I also have a relative who is African American. And immersing yourself in the flavor of the Old South before you talk to a contemporary peer who is African American, just that gives me the icks a little bit. As the carriage passed the marketplace, I turned to look, my eyes straining to recognize my quilter friend's face. I recognized her immediately, sitting in the same location amidst her tables of quilts, just as I had seen her 3 years prior. Today she was dressed in all white. She had on white slacks and a white blouse decorated with a huge lavender flower hand-painted on the front. She wore a large straw hat with a white band that had the same lavender flower painted on it as well. I completed my carriage ride. Now, this is interesting to me because, literally, I have followed the footsteps of what Jackie's talking about. I've not had a carriage ride, mind you, but I have, in a bus and on a car, driven down the street where she's talking about and looked at the marketplace. And, I could probably see her seeing, a stall that had quilts and a woman dressed this way, but again, this is kind of all that flair. It's dark under there. In the daytime, there's like you have to kind of walk inside and let your eyes adjust because it's a big, it's open air, but it's like this big roof on it. And so I think this is a lot of, just kind of flair in the storytelling that she's like, oh, I recognized her immediately. And it's like, whatever, Jackie, come on. And this is just a minor thing that I'm picking on her because it's good writing. It's, to say I was in this carriage tour and then I saw her from a distance and I recognized her right away. That's good storytelling, but I'm also like, no, you didn't, Jackie, because you couldn't see until you got into that thing. You got under the roof and then you could see her. I'm being mean and rude here. I completed my carriage ride and walked slowly down the aisles of the marketplace. I was nervous about meeting her again. Would she remember me? Well, my gosh, Jackie, if you've been calling and pestering her, maybe, well, I guess there was 3 years in between. What if I'd come this far and she still wouldn't speak to me? Or worse yet, what if she really didn't know anything more than she had already told me? With notebook in hand, I took a deep breath and hesitantly approached her. Her back was turned to me as she stood quietly arranging her quilts. I cleared my throat to get her attention. Much creative licensing. Yeah, the marketing worked. Exactly. I cleared my throat to get her attention. Miss Ozella. When she turned, I tried to hand her my business card and started to explain who I was and why I was there. With a wave of her hand, brushing my card away, she interrupted me and said, I don't care who you is. You is people, and that is all that matters. Bring over some of these quilts and make a seat for yourself beside me. Get yourself comfortable. I hesitated, but only briefly. If she was ready to talk, I was ready to listen. I was concerned about sitting on her homemade works of art, but she didn't seem to care. She positioned herself on the metal folding chair, moving quilts to either side of her and around her. I chose several rolled quilts and brought them over in front of her. After placing them on the ground, I sat down in front of her. From this position, I was looking directly up into Ozella's face. She pulled her folding chair even closer to me. I became aware that she was now physically creating a space around us, obviously meant only for her and me. After seating herself on the folding chair, she leaned down toward me, one hand resting on her knee, her index finger pointing to my notepad. She pushed her straw hat farther back on her head, and with her other hand she directed me, write this down. From the moment she said those words until she finished speaking, about 3 hours later, time stood still. The normal chaos of Saturday morning at the marketplace ceased to exist for us. Nothing and no one entered this space to disturb us. I'm sorry, Jackie, that's a straight up lie. Because I have been to this market. It is full of people, especially on a Saturday. There would have been people milling around everywhere. Now, maybe people went by and looked into the stall and went, oh, well, Miss Ozella's got a guest or something. And, maybe people were like, oh, I won't disturb this, whatever's going on here. But also, people are people. People are like, oh, excuse me, let me get in there. These booths are jam-packed, and it is no different in 1990s than it is today. And, it was right before the pandemic when I was last in Charleston. But still, this is a tourist area. It is packed, especially on a Saturday. So I have a really hard time that she sat for 3 hours in Miss Ozella's booth and had this conversation without stopping. Now, maybe Miss Ozella had a helper that was there. That's entirely possible. Somebody helping with the booth that could talk to, as she was sitting there. And again, these aren't very big booths either. But anyway, I just, this part of the story, I'm just like, really? Okay, if that's what you say. Let's see. No one entered this space to disturb us. It was as if she was going to say it was for my ears only, and that this time and space had been set aside for me to hear it. You mean when you got on a plane and came without even telling her you were coming? It felt that fate was honoring this moment. With a faraway look in her eyes, reciting something from memory, Ozella instructed me on what to write, stopping now and then only to ask me to read it back to her. It took all my journalistic energies to focus on writing the words she spoke and to not get lost in the art of her telling. I was the student, she was the teacher. I was the transcriber, she was the storyteller. At that moment, I knew that I was one of only a trusted few people who, down through history, had been told to listen carefully and remember the words she was speaking. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. Sitting beside this elderly black woman, surrounded by a sea of her handiwork, I felt that she was inviting me to share in her family stories and memories and become a part of an oral tradition that had allowed her culture to survive. I was no longer the journalist in search of a story. My role was to be much different. I felt that Ozella had very purposefully created an atmosphere where I was to receive this information. Surrounding us were only the sounds of her ancestors, family members like her mother and grandmother before her, passing words of information from one woman to another for safekeeping. During this time, I was aware of nothing but her voice and her message and the awesome responsibility she was giving me to write the story down. Seated at the feet of an older woman, I was conscious that we were taking part in a time-honored women's ritual of passing on wisdom from one generation to another. I was aware that we were bridging not only a gap of generations, but also one of race. We were transcending age, stereotypes, and boundaries. You guys, now you may not live in a place where it's very diverse. You may not live in a place that has a very big African American population. I do. And I can tell you, it would be rare for a white person to be chosen today as this receiver of information. It is sure as shit won't happen in 1994. Like, this is, Jackie's got a little bit of an ego. No, Jackie's got a lot of an ego. If she truly thinks that she is this person who's been chosen because she has met Ozella once and bought her quilt. She's called Ozella twice and been like put off with these like sort of mysterious statements. And on her second meeting of Ozella, she busts in on her booth, without any warning. And all of a sudden, she is the receiver of this important story. Do you understand now why this book was like... Because this story is I think Cuesta Benberry's piece in the beginning, like, predates, prefaces this. But yes, this is why I wanted to read this to you guys, because I'm like, I didn't want to read this book, like, publicly, but I feel like people need to understand, like, what is the issue with this book? It starts right here. And I mean, again, I'm so sorry to Jacqueline Tobin. I mean, obviously, so much time and energy on this book. But the icks, the absolute icks I get from this chapter. Until now, the story Ozella revealed to me has never been written down and shared with the public. It has been passed down orally in her family for generations. Ozella received it from from her mother, who received it from Ozella's grandmother. I absolutely believe that. I absolutely believe there's a family story that came down to Ozella. The story has survived in the memories of those women and men who have committed themselves to remembering it. Also, yeah, absolutely. I felt that Ozella was commanding me to break the silence. I am indebted to her for trusting me with this story, and I have honored it without embellishment. Raymond was the obvious choice to co-author this book. As a scholar on quilts, Raymond Dobart is a scholar on quilts and the Underground Railroad. Well, no, he's a scholar on quilts of the Underground Railroad, not in the Underground Railroad, because the Underground Railroad is a separate topic, and he is not a scholar. And in fact, a scholar has really pushed back on Raymond. Raymond. Wow, I can't talk today. Let's see, as well-known African-American quilter, Raymond recognized that, as Ozella had originally told me, quilt patterns and stitching provided an ingenious method of Underground Railroad communication. With the admonition and blessings of Mrs. Ozella McDaniel Williams, we are passing this story on, a true tale of survival, skill, transcendence, and memory. The following are the words recited to me by Ozella in Charleston, South Carolina on May 11th, 1996. So this is 96 by this point. Raymond and I have named this the Underground Railroad Quilt Code. And this is how it goes. And then there are the pictures here. So here are the pictures of all the blocks. And so it goes. There are 5 square knots on the quilt every 2 inches apart. They escaped on the 5th knot on the 10th pattern and went to Ontario, Canada. The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel. So there's the monkey wrench. Turns the wagon wheel. Here's the wagon wheel. Toward Canada on a bear's paw trail. Here's the bear's paw. To the crossroads. Once they got to the crossroads, they dug a log cabin in the ground. Log cabin. Ugh, log cabin. Shoefly told them to dress up in cotton and satin bow ties and go to the cathedral. So Shoefly and cotton and satin bow ties. To go to the cathedral church, get married, and exchange double wedding rings. Now, there are cathedral windows as a block, and double wedding rings as a block. Those are not shown because, and I'll tell you why, they could not get those particular patterns back far enough. They absolutely know that the cathedral windows technique. It's almost not even a block, really. It's a technique. And then double wedding rings are absolutely in no way documented outside of the 20th century. So, right, Mara, I'm supposed to be this extremely limited time being manhunted through the darkness of the night. Yeah, exactly. Flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars. Now, a couple of things I do know based on my tiny, tiny little bit of reading from the National Park Service about Harriet Tubman's efforts on the Underground Railroad, because we know a lot about what she and Frederick Douglass, and and again, I'm lucky to be in a part of the country where there's a lot of education with school kids about these people, and I know other parts of the U.S., they don't teach a whole lot about this. I'm lucky to be in this area. But I can tell you, like, following the North Star was like just a common knowledge in terms of, navigating. And that was something I think that was like, in Harriet Tubman's efforts, follow the North Star, follow the North Star. You get, misdirected, you follow the North Star. That is going to take you to Canada, or that's going to take you to northern states. That's common sense, right? That's navigation. And so that should be no surprise. Now, when they say dug a log cabin in the ground, there's a whole chapter about this. And it's interesting because she can't reconcile what it means to dig a log cabin in the ground. Well, those of us that read the book The Quilters, we know that at least in the West, as people were pushing west, pioneers, and also freed and runaway enslaved people, were part of that whole, westward manifest destiny and pushing west. They did dig cabins in the ground. They're called dugouts. And so that's a piece that tells me there's this little chunk of history that maybe is coming from somebody from the West. We're talking Texas, Oklahoma, like those kind of places in the West, where digging a log cabin in the ground has some, there is something you can trace back there. Now, the conjecture is that shoe fly and monkey wrench are people. And we'll talk about monkey wrench in a second when I read you the response to this. So, this is the chapter or the paragraph they have over this. At first reading, one is struck by the imagery and poetic descriptions. Yes, that's the aspect of African American story quilting and stories in general. They're so good because of these imagery and poetic descriptions. That's what makes that storytelling so rich. But beneath the language lies a much deeper, much larger story, a story that reaches back to Africa and forward to the Carolinas, connecting African symbols to familiar quilt patterns, all tied together with the sounds of spirituals and the African American struggle to escape the bonds of slavery. Now, I think all of that is beautiful. And again, I'm going back to the fact that, Marvin, dugouts were all sod. Dallas Botanical Garden has one. Oh, interesting. Oh my goodness, I would love to see that. Yes, they were all sod, but they also had things on top of them, and as they built them out, there's Mardim, did you read The Quilters? Were you with us for that? There's a lot of information in that book, and it's first person from women that were children that had gone out there. So yeah, but again, I'm going back to the fact that there's a possibility for one of these things that they can't. They couldn't come up with a reason for, and they had a whole chapter about it. Okay, so that's that chapter. Now, I wanted to get in here to this last part where she has an epilogue, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just want to read a little bit about Ozella, in that she did finally go back and speak to Ozella. And I want to say she probably was pestering Ozella all along to get information. But she went back and let's see, there's a date to that. It was over a 5-year period. So we're probably, we're pushing into the 2000s, I guess, at this point, right? Or when was this book? Having a hard time following the... Okay, 1999. So yes, we're pushing the 2000s at this point. She's, come to the end of her, whole development history on this. Oh, that is so cool. I love it when, a botanical garden. I feel like a dugout is something you would not expect to see in a botanical garden, but that's a piece of history in terms of like the pioneers and the people that came to Texas that I bet is really interesting. I have so many museums and places that I want to visit in the U.S. I will never live enough lifetimes to be able to see it all, but I have a list. I'm going to add that one. So anyway, she does go back and returns to a return to the griot, my mentor. Now, a griot, and I can't remember if I mentioned this the other day or a while back when we were talking about this, but a griot is a storyteller. It's like saying, it's a person that holds this position of storyteller, like the person who holds the history, who memorizes the stories and passes them down. It's an important thing to be. And I'm not clear on whether somebody is declared a griot or if they are just become one, but it's a position of honor. It's important. So she's turned, now suddenly Ozella's her mentor. I knew that Ozella had no children to pass the story on to. Now that was interesting to me. Ozella never had children. Or if she did, they passed away, but it sounds like she just never had children. Raymond and I had also discovered that although she had attempted to tell her story to others, no one had demonstrated any interest. I'm curious about that. Who had she told? There's a lot of things, there's a lot of statements that are made in this book, and it's like, can I have more information on that? Because who had she told that was not interested? Was it other academics and scholars? Was it, Underground Railroad people? Was it her own family? And her own family's like, Auntie, we don't care. I don't know. That's not clear in here. Moreover, Ozella's nephew had stated emphatically that his aunt never told the whole story to anyone at one time. Was I the only person to really persist in getting the story? Was I the only one who paid attention when she spoke? Was I the child entrusted to keep the family stories? Mic drop. Wow. Well, that's kind of an arrogant way to end a book. Again, I go back to the fact that, there is now and back then, we're talking 20, 30 years here of in my lifespan that I can really, I can just give some commentary on. And I just think to be a person that you're suddenly acting like you're the chosen one. Maybe she was. Maybe there was something about Jacqueline that just her personality and her efforts were such that, Miss Ozella was like, I just feel a connection with you and I want to tell you this story. That's not what I get from this. I get from this, Jacqueline was this woman rolling in from Colorado as a tourist. And on several occasions, she pestered this poor woman and said, I want to tell your story. I'm a journalist. I'm going to write a book. I've been talking to this professor at Howard University, blah, 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 blah. Now, guess what? Ozella had done master's work at Howard University. There's a lot to this story that is just, I was surprised to learn that. Now, not that I thought that, assumed Ozella wasn't educated. I didn't know. I really, by the time I got to the end of this book, I learned some things about Ozella where I was like, oh, she never had children. She, she had a degree. She did master's work at Howard University. She had lived in California and then come back east. So, she's got this really interesting story. And I really think Jackie could have done a better job of telling Ozella's family story. And then talk about how this code and all of the symbolism and connectedness is just part of this rich storytelling history. We don't have to force this story to be true for it to be fascinating and for it to be a really important aspect of African American quilting. Am I saying that Ozella's story is not true? Absolutely not. There's probably lots of aspects of it that are. But again, reading the story tells me that there were a quilt or quilts in her family where a story was woven based on what was in the quilts. And that is how the story comes down through the generations. And, you know, her grandmother may have made quilts that where she was trying to save the story. And that, again, is part of African American story quilts, is putting down a story. They usually have a lot of symbolism. They have metaphors. Does that not sound like what the quilt code? You know, symbolism and metaphors. And you're using symbols after the fact, not symbols at the time. Nobody was hanging out a quilt telling, you know, runaway enslaved people to go put on silks and satins and get married in a cathedral. Like that's not what was happening. It was somewhere in there was a real story about people who fled and maybe got to Sandusky, Ohio, and were able then to get married, or maybe, you know, I mean, there's just all kinds of you know, outcomes to what is rooted in probably a true story or stories. It feels to me like they're multiple stories. Okay. Now, I want to read the response to this. Let me find it. Uh-oh. Here we go. So this comes from, and I apologize, it's on my phone because, you know, sometimes you got to do your reading on the fly. But this is Camden, let's see, it's Camden, historiccamdencounty.com. So this is Camden County, New Jersey. And so this is written by Giles R. Wright in 2001. It is entitled Critique, Hidden in Plain View, The Secret Story of Quilts and the Underground Railroad by Giles R. Wright, June 4th, 2001. This is the text of a 2-page printed statement distributed by Giles Wright at the June 4th, 2001 Underground Railroad Day at the Camden County Historical Society. Mr. Wright was the keynote speaker at that event. And my guess is that book having come out 2 years before, people were like, hey, Dr. Wright, or Mr. Wright. It says Mr. Wright. I thought he was a professor. In any event. Hey, Giles, tell us about this story. Okay, so this is what he says. This is his paper, or his statement. As someone keenly interested in the Underground Railroad, and he simplifies it with UGRR, especially its history in New Jersey, I felt compelled to write this critique of Hidden in Plain View, the secret story of quilts in the Underground Railroad. I was concerned that this study greatly misrepresents the operation of the UGRR. It gives those who know very little about Black American history in general, and the Underground Railroad in particular, a distorted view of this form of slave protest. The UGRR, shrouded as it already is in many myths and legends, hardly needs another. And as I encountered many who have read this book, all of whom believe its argument, I became convinced that the making of another Underground Railroad myth was already underway. This critique seeks to help in reversing this process. So what I really like about his commentary is the fact that he is an Underground Railroad scholar, and he's got very specific things to say. Not just like, oh, well, this was said and that was said, and, you know, she tried to tell the story, but no one would listen. Well, who was it she was telling the story to? He's got the receipts. That's the problem. When you want to make an emphatic statement, you got to have receipts to prove it. If you want to make here's some conjecture, wouldn't it be really cool if this was the story? You know, we can't prove it, but my gosh, look at this. What do you guys think? Like, that's such a better way than to say X plus Y equals Z. And that's what the book says. And I think that's where the problem lies. So he says, among these reasons are the following. Number one, Neither of the co-authors is a Black historian. In order to write knowledgeably about the Underground Railroad, you must first be a student of the large Black historical experience in which the story of the Underground Railroad is located. Jacqueline L. Tobin teaches women's studies at the University of Denver. So that's right, I forgot she was a professor and a journalist. Dr. Raymond G. Dobard is an art/quilt historian at Howard University. Neither is therefore really equipped to discuss the Underground Railroad. The book's many factual errors, ones that would never have been made by even a novice in the field of African American history, reveal this. I'll cite only 3. I'm wondering if some of the other stuff that I flagged was like, what are they talking about? I can't even parse this. I'm wondering if some of those are like the other parts. I'll cite only 3. First, Richard Allen established in 1816 the AME Church, not the Bethel AME Church. So, you know, there are a bunch of different types of churches and African religions, or, you know, African American religions that came out of, you know, enslaved people's worship, and sometimes they worshipped under the guise of Christianity, you know, just in terms of you know, religious and spiritual traditions coming from Africa, and then sometimes they were converts, and, you know, they formed their own churches and kind of based on different religious models. I mean, they're Christian. But you've got different, I guess, the best way I can describe it, if, you know, in terms of Christianity, they're different flavors of African American Christianity, just like there are different flavors of just, you know, your garden variety mainstream Christianity. And so there is a difference. It's not, you can't simply say the AME Church versus the Bethel AME Church. They are different things. You can't use them interchangeably. And he mentions that's on page 60. Second, on page 62, the co-authors write, in 1871, William Still, a free Black in Philadelphia and a famous conductor. I actually referenced this one because I did a little bit of research in Maryland. William Still is a person whose name comes up. He was, I think, briefly incarcerated in Baltimore. And so I had some information on him. So Giles says this reference makes no sense because A, slavery was outlawed in Philadelphia in 1780, and B, the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. So this is 1871 that they're referencing. Also, Still was a station master, not a conductor, like his friend Harriet Tubman. So Harriet Tubman was a conductor. A station master was something different. Third, George Rawick did not compile oral history interviews of former slaves in the 1930s as part of the WPA project. Rawick, a well-known slave historian, was in fact born in 1929. So, whoa, that's a big mistake. So, you know, to give you some perspective there, during the 30s, the Depression, you know, there was a lot of people, professionals, that were given jobs by the WPA to like just keep people like employed. So you had like, I mean, a lot of really cool programs. You have these oral history programs that, you know, journalists and writers were getting involved in. You have all this like really incredible like design documentation, where they had tapped artists to create like a design library. A lot of really cool stuff going on in the 30s. But it's a pretty darn big mistake to say that this particular person compiled oral history in the 30s when the man was born in 1929. Like, you didn't necessarily have Google in 1999 when this book got published, but dang, I think you could have pretty easily done your fact checking. Number 2. Aside from the oral testimony of Ozella McDaniel Williams, the book offers no documentation for its thesis, relying instead on sheer conjecture and speculation in its lack of fidelity to historical truth. While I would be indeed the last person to discount the value of oral testimony, the oral tradition relied on here needs, I think, corroborating historical evidence. The 2 most obvious sources offer none. A, the 19th century slave narratives, and B, the oral testimonies taken from former slaves in the 1930s. Similarly, the classic UGRR studies of William Still, 1872, and Wilbur H. Siebert, 1898, Doesn't it also seem strange that according to the book, no one in the black community seemed interested in William's testimony? And why weren't others in this community in possession of the same oral tradition that Williams related? Isn't it likely that Williams was putting Tobin on? William's story is nice and appealing, but it defies logic. It doesn't stand up to close scrutiny. And so those are a lot of the things we're saying, like, you know, just as people with common sense. You're like, all the stories I've heard and like all of the stuff that has truly been documented about the Underground Railroad was that the people that took the Underground Railroad were hiding out, they were concealed, they were traveling in darkness, they were in the woods, not out in the open. You know, in terms of the Harriet Tubman stories, like these are people like tromping through swamps and, you know, like really rough, what we would consider rural, deep woods, swampy kind of stuff. They weren't like exposing themselves close to, you know, where there were people, because again, there were these like slave catchers, these awful people that were out there just trying to snatch runaways and get them back to their owners. Like, ugh. And so, yeah, how is this beautiful story about, you know, using a quilt as a map and looking at quilts hanging on lines to direct you? Like, it just, there is no logic there. It's a nice story. Number 3, contrary to popular belief, and this is the one that I was like, whoa, this is big. This is the stuff that comes from being an Underground Railroad scholar, somebody who has very carefully studied all of the information. This is number 3. Contrary to popular belief, the overall number of Underground Railroad runaways was very small, a tiny fraction of the total enslaved population. Nowhere in the book is this indicated. The book, in fact, provides no figures for the total number of Underground Railroad participants. This is a critical omission. Why? Because in order for the use of quilts to send coded messages to Underground Railroad runaways to make any sense, a large number of participants is required. Otherwise, why go to such lengths to devise so elaborate a system of encoded quilts for a mere handful of runaways? But a handful of runaways is precisely what we have in this book. This is because the book focuses on Underground Railroad fugitive slaves coming out of Charleston. The number of such persons would have to be small for 3 simple reasons. First, most Underground Railroad participants came from Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Virginia, the slave states closest to the north. Maryland, for example, was the source of the slaves that Harriet Tubman guided to freedom. And again, we have this really rich, both oral and documented history. So we are able to take the stories in Maryland and connect them to what documented history. And I'm not talking about documented history of like, oh, here's a paper, but other people's recorded, you know, memories and stories. So you don't have to have an actual thing to document oral history. You just need other corroborating oral histories. South Carolina, therefore, was not a major source of Underground Railroad participants. Second, since the book's narrow focus is on Underground Railroad participants coming out of Charleston, not out of South Carolina, the number of fugitive slaves under consideration is further reduced. Third, and of critical importance, most runaway slaves did not head north as part of the Underground Railroad, but remained in the South. Some, for example, fled to outlier communities, while others went into southern cities where they attempted to pass as free blacks. This happened a lot. I mean, this was, you know, I mentioned Alexandria, Virginia was one such place. I mean, it sounds like Charleston itself. New Orleans, I know, was one place. And then you've got, like, for people that made it really far north, you've got Philadelphia, and like I said, Baltimore. Thus, we have a seemingly contradictory image of Charleston. On one hand, according to the unsubstantiated documentation offered and hidden in plain view, it was a city from which presumably at least a considerable number of slaves were fleeing to head north as part of the Underground Railroad. On the other hand, based on an important source of primary documentation, runaway slave notices, we know for a fact that it was a city to which many a fugitive fled and tried to assume the identity of a free black. So there is documentation. And, you know, those runaway slave notices, I mean, as gross as it is, the thing is, plantation owners had I mean, there's a reason why enslaved people, I mean, we talk about chattel slavery. Chattel basically means stuff I own that has value. So your chattel can be and farm equipment, your chattel can be your furniture. It's things that are not like property, like real estate property or land property. It's movable property. And an enslaved person's movable, therefore they are chattel. And I mean, as gross as that is, that was the reality then. And so if you lose through no fault of your own some piece of your chattel, you are going to do anything you can to replace it, to get it back, right? I mean, even today, like, consider your car as chattel. If you lost your car, would you not try to get it back? Like, that's the mentality. And as gross as it is, it's the way it was. And so you do see these notices. If you have newspapers.com or go to the library and check it out, you can Google, look up any historic newspaper that's available online for the United States in the 1860s, and earlier. You definitely see these notices. They're really easy to find. They're out there. Number 4. Fugitive slaves coming out of South Carolina who used the Underground Railroad usually headed in a northeasterly direction and not towards Cleveland, as Hidden in Plain View asserts. And so, like I said, we're talking about geographic barriers. It is hard to get through down the Appalachian Trail today, going in either direction, because the Appalachians are a place of like dense wilderness and mountains. I mean, it's hard. And, I'm not saying that, these runaway enslaved people did not have like the gumption and the drive and the desire to do it. But my gosh, if it's hard today for people who are carrying GPS and cell phones and nice tents and hiking boots and all that stuff, it's hard for those people to hike the Appalachian Trail. It's really hard to believe that people with literally nothing but the clothes on their back and like a quilt they snagged, to think that they went from South Carolina to Ohio, like diagonally across the Appalachians. I mean, that is just like amazing. And it should take you many years to do that if you did it. So, I just go back to the fact, like, everything he's saying to me, what I know, having like driven through these places, I'm like, yeah, I get it. Now here's next important thing where I think that Jackie and Raymond Doeward like really screwed themselves. Indeed, there are essentially 2 Underground Railroad corridors. The western one involved slaves from such states as Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. We're talking about states that are on the other side of the Appalachians. They, in a manner similar to 20th century immigrants, tended to head towards such states as Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. Again, states that are on the other side of the Appalachians. Runaways from states along the Atlantic coastline tended to follow the coastline, the Eastern Corridor, and came into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. Some settled in these states before heading usually to Canada. Thus, it appears that South Carolinian slaves most likely would have traveled up the coastline rather than cross the Appalachian Mountains and gone to Cleveland. We have the documentation of this, the Eastern, trail via Harriet Tubman. Stills, 1872. Now, William Still is a station master. 1872, the Underground Railroad documents the use of the Eastern Corridor by fugitive slaves from South Carolina, their travel to Philadelphia. In fact, interestingly enough, even the Underground Railroad map in Hidden in Plain View shows no route leading from Charleston to Cleveland. It should also be noted that the co-authors never tell us whether the system of encoded quilt messages they offer was unique to Charleston. They are silent on the system's existence in other parts of the antebellum South. Why? Because Ozell is the only person that can tell them the story. Number 5. Not all Underground Railroad participants engaged in making very detailed plans before their flight. And this is something I mentioned earlier. I liken this to, we still have horrible things going on in our world now. Liken this to the fact that we've got, modern day essentially modern day slaves in, human trafficking. And yeah, do some of those folks make very detailed plans to escape? Yeah. But I would say 90% of the time, people that escape human trafficking, they see an option, an opportunity, and they're like, I got to book it now. This is my only chance. And I would say that happened quite frequently for freedom seekers. So Hidden in Plain View seems to assume that Underground Railroad participants planned their escape over a considerable period of time that allowed them to learn the 10-point quilt code. Recent scholarship pertaining to fugitive slaves suggests that running away was much more complex than this, motivated as it was by various causes. In some cases, fugitive slaves, out of necessity, ran away immediately. This reduced further the number of Charleston runaways who would have used the encoded quilt system outlined in Hidden in Plain View. We were never told in Hidden in Plain View, this is number 6, sorry. We were never told in Hidden in Plain View who created and operated the encoded quilt system. This was my biggest question. I was like, there's all these stories in there like, oh, when they saw this quilt block, they knew it was time to go. And I'm like, oh, okay, but who took the time to make that quilt and hang it out to tell them to go? Was it another enslaved person who maybe had information? Was it, some of the white people, the abolitionists that were helping? They do mention those things, but they don't connect it like clearly because they can't. They don't have any kind of either oral tradition or documented history to connect it. Who made the quilts and hung them? Was it free blacks living in the South? Was it other enslaved people? The book does not comment on the great risks for either group, another crucial omission. That's the thing. You've got a secret system that is dangerous to be involved in or talk about. So why would you go to the effort of making a quilt versus just whispering, That's why the oral tradition's so strong and it's such an important thing, because it's not written. It can be encapsulated and kept. Why wouldn't communication with potential Underground Railroad fugitives be done verbally? What would be the logic of using quilts to communicate messages to slaves anyway? Any understanding of how the slave community functioned makes an assumption of this kind absurd. Many other questions about the Underground Railroad are also conspicuously left unanswered. When were the fugitives most likely to travel? Example, time of day or year. We know that it was in the cover of darkness. So time of day, we've got documentation of when that was. Were they likely to travel alone? What is the profile of the typical Underground Railroad participant, age/gender? Now, this is interesting in terms of traveling alone. One thing that this book says, and again, I don't know, is it something that, is it anecdotal? Is it an actual story? But what they're saying is that there were light-skinned women who were able to pass, and we know that happened. In fact, I have helped my sister-in-law do some research in her own history, and small world, I have identified one of her ancestors who was likely born enslaved, but was young at emancipation, and he was very light-skinned and most likely passed as white in my community. He lived in Baltimore County where I live. Now, my sister-in-law is from California. What an amazing story. And I was able to trace him because he was a barber here in Baltimore, and he and his family, some of his children, ended up as part of the railroad, not the Underground Railroad, but the actual railroad. And he worked for the railroad as a porter and worked his way across the country. His family would settle in, a particular state. I think they were in Colorado, they were in Arizona, they were in California. And, there is this through line for his story. Now, we're talking post-emancipation. And the wonderful thing about the railroad, if you don't know anything about researching African-American family history, the railroad itself, so the east-west railroad lines and the north-south, were a really important place for freed enslaved people to get work. And the push out west was, we're dealing with a lot less racist attitude towards at least people getting a job. Now, that's not saying that things weren't super awful and racist with the railroad, because they were. There's stories out in California about like the Chinese folks that were brought in, there's a whole story. But the great thing about the actual railroad, the infrastructure, is that they kept good records. So if you are researching somebody who's their family was employed by the railroad infrastructure, you've got this really super source of information. So anyway, I digressed about that. So and here he's asking these questions. Were they traveling alone? What was their profile? What was the success rate? What were the penalties for being caught? I suspect the co-authors never addressed these questions because of their lack of familiarity with the historiography of the Underground Railroad. Their book indeed tells us precious little about the Underground Railroad, except that quilts were used to direct escaping slaves. I believe the book's only contribution is to document what we already know. African American quilts were greatly influenced by African American textile designs, and I think this is what Gladys Marie Fry's work is in, and thus exemplify African cultural continuities found among Black Americans. Finally, 2 sentences reveal much about the competence of the co-authors to reconstruct the Black past. This is the one where he's like, shade, shade, shade. On the plantation, the monkey, and this is a quote from the book. On the plantation, the monkey wrench was a tool being used by the blacksmith, since there were no plumbers during slavery. In Africa, too, the monkey wrench was used primarily by the blacksmith and was therefore an honored tool. The co-authors seem unaware that the monkey wrench was invented in this country around 1850. How could it then have been so significant of a tool on antebellum plantations? And given this time frame, for what purpose would its use in Africa have made it an honored tool? And so that is the end of his response. And so I thought that was really interesting. And in the book, monkey wrench is this, name given. And I mentioned the blacksmiths. They were important people in Charleston. Even as enslaved men, they were like incredible artisans and craftspeople. And you can't just like grab a hammer and become a blacksmith. Like you have to have the training, and it's a hard job. So they have like that piece of it, but then they've made up this whole story about like, well, monkey wrench meant the local blacksmith because he was he had this specific information, and he knew these things. And yeah, I think that I really like Giles Wright's response, because I just feel like it's it's good stuff. So, well, somehow I managed to make that rant 2 hours, and now we didn't have any time for the quilts. But you know what? That's what we'll do next time. I want to show you. Look at the pictures in this book. Oh my goodness. Cuesta Benberry. Look at this. There are just some amazing quilts in here. And maybe it's good I didn't get to this today, because you know what I'll do this weekend when I have a few minutes? I will look through both of these books side by side, and I will pick some quilts that are either maybe similar, the same patterns, and we can like compare them. I think that'll be fun. And Druid, I know you wrote something here that I think is important, and I want to read this. So, so Druid is saying, we can look for the new human trafficking or distress signal. To make this signal, you hold up your open palm, tuck your thumb against it, and then close your fingers over your thumb. When this signal is given, those on the receiving end should know how to check on the victim discreetly and seek emergency help if needed. Am I doing it right? Is it this way? Let me know, Druid. So yeah, there, in terms of human trafficking, and what I think is, this is interesting, and it's yucky interesting, but my grandmother was from South Carolina. She was from the western part, so up against Appalachia. I am an Appalachian child at heart. So she was from that part of the state. And right before the pandemic, my grandmother died in 2018. And in 2019, my mom and I were like, let's go down there. My mom said to me, there's some elderly relatives that are like your grandmother's age and even older. And, You haven't seen them since you were a baby. Let's go down. Let's, do all the things. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. So, of course, we went to Charleston because, we're tourists. We love, we love to do the touristy stuff. So we did like a couple days in Charleston, and then we drove across the state and to stay where my grandmother grew up. And again, it's in the mountains. And if you, like on the East Coast, you've got 95. And those of you that have, been to the East Coast, know the East Coast, 95 is like the highway that runs all the way from Maine down to the tip of Florida. And so that's a major highway system. So when you look at like towns and cities that are off of that highway system, you tend to find things like gun running and drug running. And I have family members who've been involved, and simply because it's a major highway system. Quick and easy to jump on the highway. You've got some turnpikes in there that are a real pain in the butt, but for the most part, you like quickly, you can get from, well, because I've done it, you can get from Virginia to Florida and like to the end of Florida, like Miami, in like 18 hours, something like that. It's less than a day if you drive straight through. So lots of bad things happen on the highway, but also kind of over, into the western parts of the cities, you've got like, I've got an ad starting in a minute. You've got these like kind of branching off trails, and you do have some significant east-west ones. And so like Breezewood, Pennsylvania is one like big like intersection of all of these different routes. Another one is in the area where my grandmother grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, and she was born and raised in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. So you've got, again, like these kind of routes. Well, my mom and I stayed at a Hampton Inn, and because my mom loves to stay at Hampton Inns, they're cheap, but they're clean and reliable. And this is a brand new, totally refurbished Hampton Inn, and it had two really things that like punched me in the gut. One, you're gonna laugh when I tell you the first one. This is the light humor. This Hampton Inn, if you've never stayed in a Hampton Inn, it is like, it's not fancy. It's nice. It's clean. It's cheap. That's what Hampton Inn is like. This place, I kid you not, had bidets. Bidets! They had bidets. My mother and I were absolutely shocked to go into a hotel like this and have bidets. They also had smart mirrors. So like if you're taking a shower and you want to like Bluetooth your phone, your Spotify to this mirror and hear the music and the weather and all that stuff, they had those. And I'm like, bizarre. They also had a lot of information about human trafficking. And I was like, oh my God, it should have come as no surprise to me. But being in this area where I kind of felt like there's a lot of my family there, and it's this nice quaint town and, all this kind of stuff. And then to see, this information about human trafficking, like, are you being human trafficked? Here's what here's how you can reach out. Here's how you can get help. It was such a punch in the gut. And so, yes, I think as important it is to explore and talk about the history of enslaved people in the United States, it didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. Women and children, especially, and when I say children, I mean it's usually teenage girls that get sucked into this human trafficking stuff. Is it as prevalent as we think it is? Maybe not, but is it prevalent? Yeah, it's something that to definitely look out for. It is very easy for people to get sucked into it. It's, and we're talking about people that are already at risk. So if I may give the public service announcement here is, learn a little bit about those things and know what to look for, particularly if you live in places where you've got like a crossroads. You've got a lot of people that just drive through. I know particularly, I'm right off of 95 where I grew up, where I went to college, where I live now. It's not far. It's good to know these things. You never know when you're going to stop in a restaurant, stay at a hotel, run into something and you see it and you're like, that doesn't look right. Is that person maybe calling out for help? And I think that it's that whole attitude of like, see something, say something. Certainly we can all get a little like, conspiracy theory, like, oh, everybody's a serial killer, But I think common sense should prevail. And again, if you see something, you don't personally have to get involved, but you can let somebody in an authority know. And because that happens too often, people don't say things and they think, oh, it's not my business. And come to find out there was something bad going on, So it's that attitude of like, be a good Samaritan and, speak up if you see something that looks wrong. I mean, obviously don't put yourself in danger, but, speak up for others. I think that's important. And, don't let things go by that you think are problematic or you don't feel good about. Let somebody know. So I'm sorry to kind of end on that as sort of like a bummer, but also I think it's important that we pay attention to these things and do our best to put kindness out there and try to make the world a better place however we are able to do it. So that said, I'm going to let you guys go and finish up your Friday Eve. And I hope you guys have something fun planned for the weekend. I don't know what the weather's going to be like in everybody's neck of the woods. I know for me, it's supposed to be really good. Yesterday was like in the 60s. I think today is in the 70s. Oh, yeah. Oh gosh, Quiltish. Yeah. Yeah. The questionable things that go on, right under our noses sometimes. Yeah. So that's why, it's not just like, oh, I stopped at a truck stop to use the bathroom and I saw something. Yeah. Draw eyes out. But yes, have a wonderful weekend, everybody. I've given myself homework. I'm going to look at these Arkansas books to have something good for you on Monday. So yes, Mondays and Thursdays, you can find me here, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Don't forget, Jill and I will be at Quilt Nerding, Tuesday nights, and we are on YouTube. So I will see you guys soon. Have a wonderful quilty weekend. I hope you have fun things planned, and I will catch up with you on Monday. Mwah! Big hugs.